Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I am your host, Jubayub, and today we'll be talking to Anand Gopal. He is an American journalist and author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes, which was a finalist for the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. This is not a conversation about Afghanistan, however, although we did bring it up a bit briefly. Rather, this is a conversation about the Middle East and North Africa, and specifically one that is being held 10 years since the 2011 revolutions changed so many of our lives. We focus on an article he wrote for Catalyst Journal entitled The Arab Thermidor, in which attempts to present a class analysis of the 2011 revolutions. We focused on Syria, but then, as often happens on this podcast, we started covering quite a lot more than that. We touched upon things like US and Russian imperialism, the so-called war on terror, and even the role of social media. So that's today's episode. This episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tara Beat. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Anand Gopal. I'm a writer and researcher, and I cover Syria mostly these days.
So you wrote this long piece for Catalyst Journal entitled The Arab Thermidor, I believe. So let's get straight into it if that's okay. And we'll sort of use the essay itself as the anchor of our conversation. And so the question that I have for you is, it's not an easy one, so I'm starting with a difficult one. How would you go about even starting with a class analysis of the Arab Spring? And if that's okay with you, do also mention like what Thermidor means, just in case people don't know.
Sure. Yeah, Thermidor refers to the period of reaction after the French Revolution. So the idea is that you had a revolution in some of the Arab countries, and then a period of intense reaction in the form of counter-revolutions. So it was just an attempt to kind of evoke some of that historical memory. And, how to start on a class analysis of the Arab Spring. Well, it's what struck me in the time I spent reporting on this is the way in which, unlike previous revolutions, even those like the Iranian Revolution of 1979, one of the things that are striking about these uprisings was the way in which class demands were not at the forefront of the protesters, what they were demanding. And to me, I think we're so used to in the last 30, 40 years of not expecting major class demands in social movements because of the epoch we live in today. But if you look historically at other revolutions, great revolutions like the Iranian, Chinese, Russian, French, etc., you always saw that class demands were central to the uprising. So instead, I approached it by turning the question on its head: is why aren't we seeing protesters articulate their grievances in these terms? So that's really what led me to try to better understand what was happening. And as I would get to know the uprisings in different areas on an intimate level or granular level, I began to realize that actually class did matter quite a bit. Even though it wasn't expressed as on the level of discourse, it was actually quite important. So trying to understand that contradiction was something that drove me to start this research.
Yeah, and I do highly recommend people give this a read, and I think it's behind a paywall, so they have to subscribe to Catalyst Journal, which I recommend they do as well. It's a very interesting platform. So I'm gonna I've been kind of racking my brain as to how to ask some of the questions, because they're both very broad and very specific at the same time, which it makes for an interesting conversation. When I think of Syria, usually it's the country I think of the most. From a geopolitical point of view, it's the differences between the Russian governments and the US government. There is a deep cynicism that actually links them in many ways, what we might call realpolitik, but I feel it's actually more cynical than that. But the question... One thing that I know you have definitely been dealing with, let me put it this way, is that whenever you say that there is no regime change in Syria, that there has never been a regime change policy from the American side in Syria, obviously not from the Russian side either, and that when Obama, for example, would say like Assad must go, he was referring to the individual, like Bashar Assad must go, but then the regime would stay, kind of like a la Egypt. But we're 10 years down the line. The regime is still there. Obviously, Russia and Iran are also there, and America and Turkey to different extents as well in different parts. But the ridicule and the denial of this reality remains whenever we say that there is no regime change in Syria, even though it's been 10 years and regime change has yet to come. So my question to you is, not necessarily to respond to these people directly, because I feel like many people have already tried to do that and it doesn't always work. Mostly doesn't work, actually. But my question to you is, like, how would you even explain the policies of foreign powers in a country like Syria? There are multiple ones, so you can maybe zero in on the ones that you want. Up to you. Like, feel free to answer however you feel most comfortable on that. It's a big question as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I view the U.S. and its allies on the one hand, and Russia and its allies on the other hand, as both examples of different types of counter-revolutionary forces. But the actual way in which they pursued that aim was quite different. Right? So, like in Russia and Iran's case, it's when they say they have no regime policy. Obviously, they have a regime preservation policy, which is not just the regime as a system at large, but also Assad and his family and everything that goes with it. I think the on the other side, U.S., Turkey, Jordan, Saudi, Qatar, the policies were a bit more complex, I would say. So if I could start with, like, for example, the United States, the U.S. in like the first 2 years of the uprising saw a situation in which there was a regime that they were politically opposed to, but also that they were concerned about the alternatives to that regime. You remember, this is in the context of the war on terror, which has been the main driving policy of the U.S. for the last 20 years. They were looking first and foremost at, is this going to be something that's going to hurt us in our war and quote unquote against terror, right? And so when the first weapons started to come into Syria, which is around January, February 2012, so far as I can tell, through Turkey and from Muslim Brotherhood networks and others, the U.S.'s main concern at that point for the first 6 months of 2012 is to try to control that weapons flow, because they wanted to control they wanted, like any imperial power, they wanted to control the outcome about what's happening, right? What happens in Syria subsequently was that it was very hard to control the outcome because of so many different factors, and that difficulty in trying to control the outcome, coming on the heels of America's either defeat or follies in Iraq and Afghanistan, made the Obama government administration hesitant to try to wade in and try to control the outcome, right? I think what they would have preferred is a Yemen type, more than even Egypt, like Yemen initially. This idea that you can get together people who seem like they're part of the opposition and have a transition government, right? Obviously, we know what happened in Yemen, and that would turn out to be a disaster. But I think that kind of change, moving it to a state that was more amenable to U.S. policies, I think what they preferred. But there didn't really seem to be an opportunity to pursue that kind of policy in the beginning, because you had very quickly, like, hundreds, if not thousands, of different armed groups. You had Jabhat al-Nusra, you had various other groups, and contrary to, I think, a very wrong and simplistic analysis of the U.S. is funding Al-Qaeda, it was the opposite. The U.S.'s main purpose was driven by their concern about Al-Qaeda, actually. So they're trying to keep weapons. First, they're trying to keep weapons from just going into the black market. CIA came and set up a station in Turkey in the summer of 2012, and they were just there monitoring the weapons flows. Later on, they got involved to try to support with Saudi Arabia certain groups that they thought would keep the weapons away from from what they call the extremists. So that was their policy from the very beginning. But Syria was just, I think, too complicated and too messy for them to actually do anything outside of just trying to manage it. Now, when ISIS came aboard, that was very clear. It was easy. Now they could just, and they had they had the SDF, they had other groups that they could support. They could go after ISIS. So you really see what a U.S. intervention actually looks like in Syria after 2014. That's what the U.S. intervention looks like, which is a mix of, like, really supporting a group like the YPG and the SDF, and also bringing to bear extraordinary firepower. Before 2014, you didn't really see that. If you want, I can talk about Turkey, Qatar, and others too, because they had a slightly different policy, right? So if you look at all the foreign countries, I think you can divide them into two categories. You had the U.S., Jordanian, Saudi axis on the one side, and then you had Qatar, Turkey on the other. And the U.S., Saudi, Jordanian axis was mostly involved with supporting non-Muslim Brotherhood, like tribal elements, groups that had historical links to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, other groups that didn't really have a lot of social capital inside the country. So there's for example, just as an example of a type of rebel commander that these groups supported was Jamal Maruf, who was a anti-Nusra rebel commander, quite corrupt, by the way, he was, from Idlib province. This is the type of person they supported. On the other side of it was Turkey and Qatar. Qatar had historic links to the Muslim Brotherhood and also to a kind of a wing of the Salafi movement that was like a merger between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia. That kind of Salafism was what was being supported by Qatar and by certain groups in Kuwait. So Ahrar al-Sham, which is one of the most important Salafi groups in Syria, was supported pretty heavily by Qatar. All the Muslim Brotherhood groups, Liwa al-Tawheed, which is an important Muslim Brotherhood group in northern Aleppo countryside, supported by the Brotherhood. And then sometimes in a given city, you had a divide, the Islamist factions, Brotherhood and Salafi factions all getting their money from Qatar and from Turkey. And then the non-Islamist factions getting their funding from Saudi and in the south in Jordan. And Qatar and Turkey just funded their proxies a lot heavier, a lot more than the other side. So as you can see, it's a very complicated and very messy battlefield. And that's the bottom line, I think, is just a take-home point is that it was too messy and too complicated for a power like the United States, which historically has been very hostile to independent movements and popular movements. That's not something they could easily control.
Yeah, and just because we've mentioned most of them already, can you mention Russia and Iran and especially the differences in some of their priorities when it comes to Syria?
Yeah, well, Russia and Iran, on the face of it, they both want to preserve the regime, right? Both as a bulwark against the Western powers. There's other story. There's a pipeline goes from Lebanon and Hezbollah to Iran and Iraq. If you can think of the Iranian zone of control, which now stretches from Iran to basically to most of Iraq to a good part of Syria into Lebanon, right? Iran's been able to extend itself as a regional power in its battle against Saudi. But there's also differences between Russia and Iran, which is kind of interesting. If you follow what's happening now, especially in the regime areas of Syria, Russia and Iran are subtly backing different players, and there's all sorts of tensions. There's a multimillionaire regime crony named Rami Makhluf, who's a relative of Assad, who is one of the richest people in Syria, who's now is running afoul of the regime, possibly because he's falling into this kind of Russian-Iranian these differences. There are Iranian-backed militias in the regime-controlled areas of Syria, in Deir ez-Zor and in the Membish countryside and in southern Syria. And there's Russian-backed militias as well. So in parts of Syria where the regime has retaken control, some of the former rebels who have reconciled with the regime, some of them are being funded by the Russians. Others are being funded by the Iranians. And there's actually kind of a low-wage battle between these two. So I think there's a rather simplistic narrative that some people might have, that you have these crazies on one side and the regime on the other side. But actually, if you look on the regime side, there are warlords, there are gangsters, there are militias that are battling each other. Syria as a country just exists on a map. There's not as a state, it's barely functioning.
Okay, so just going back to the piece to the Arab Thermidor. You also explained in the beginning, you're evoking a comparison to the uprisings of the 1840s, 1848 being you described the 2011 uprisings as having the potential to usher in, quote, the greatest democratic transformation since 1848. To kind of use the term I used before, the cynicism that I'm describing when I'm describing the big government players, which I think is a boring point to make because it's very obvious. But I'm still very unsatisfied personally as to why there hasn't been a class dimension, at least maybe not at the forefront, but most of the time it wasn't even there, or at least it wasn't as much there as it should have been. How do you go about trying to understand why that is happening. And here I'll kind of evoke the timeline that you draw, and there's the table, the very useful table that's in front of me, of like how, you know, the regime types after the independence, you first had the oligarchy, liberal slash monarchical, is that the word? And then populist authoritarian, and then bureaucratic authoritarian, and then neoliberal authoritarian. So can you kind of draw a timeline a bit for some context for those who don't know, and maybe this will help us explain just quote unquote what went wrong in 2011.
Sure. And I'll focus on Syria, but the timeline is roughly the same for most of the countries involved in the Arab revolutions. So in Syria, coming out of the French mandate, when Syria got independence in the mid-40s, the group that essentially took power were oligarchs. And by oligarchs, I mean a mix of big industrialists and big landowners. And some of these landowners had huge, like latifundia, with huge estates, where they had sharecroppers and slaves. Slavery was, I think a lot of people don't realize, slavery was actually present especially along the Euphrates River basin. And so I think at one point I calculated, I can't remember if this is in the piece or not, but if you go from Aleppo to Deir ez-Zor, which is more than half the country, along the river, something like 9 families owned all of that land. So it was extraordinary inequality and extraordinary exploitation of the peasantry. And at the same time, the same people who were controlling all that land were based in the cities like Aleppo and Damascus, and were championing a form of democracy. And that form of democracy was, you know, they would have elections. In fact, in 1954, Syria had the first real elections in the Arab world, even though the elections were big man politics, kind of like what we have here in the United States in the 19th century, where, you know, people would use patronage to get votes, etc. But this period from about 1946 to 1958, I call the liberal oligarchic period. Liberal because they believed in certain types of freedoms, like freedom of speech. It was a remarkable period for freedom of speech. There was newspapers, there was freedom of expression, and freedom of markets. So in that sense, liberal. And that period lasted for about 12 years. Now, if you track the vote total of these liberal oligarchs, you see that they very precipitously decline in their support. And they lose that support to the left, to the Ba'ath Party, and to a lesser extent to the Communist Party. And the reason is because of the land question, the agrarian question, the extreme inequality in the country, in which the vast majority of people were peasants or on the land, meant that the question of land equity, land distribution was the single most important political question. The liberals clung to the belief that they could just have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, but not have basic social services and equity. And because of that, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party grew tremendously in its support. It recruited primarily among teachers and among the army and among the peasantry. And 1958, there was a coup, and the Egyptian regime, Nasser, basically had a union with Syria. And at that point, Arab nationalists were in power, who had a left-wing program of trying to nationalize, among other things, of trying to nationalize these estates. So they broke up these huge estates. They redistributed the land. It was a very corrupt process, you know, but it was still an extraordinary redistribution of wealth, despite all those problems, right? And what you had in the 60s and 70s was the birth of an Arab middle class, essentially, from this process, a Syrian middle class, let's say, where you had millions of essentially serfs who, for the first time, got their little parcel of land and were able to work on it and save up enough money to, you know, send their children, let's say, to vocational school or to university. At the same time, the Syrian regime, the Ba'athist regimes, various ones of the 60s, and then the Assad regime beginning in 1970, instituted a whole host of social services. You know, so people who went to teachers college would get a guaranteed job after graduation. There was essentially free education, free healthcare, various other things. So there was a social safety net. There was some protections from the free market, and in that context, you had the growth of the Arab middle class. Of course, that all sounds great, but on the other hand, there was no political rights whatsoever. So this is, and I talk about this in the article, it's kind of like the trade-off that took place across the Middle East, which is that you had to surrender any ability to independently politically organize, and in exchange, you had some protection from the variations and the violence of the free market, let's say.
Yeah, you call it torture chambers and butter.
Torture chambers and butter, exactly. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these regimes had deep support, but rather it gave them stability. And this is what allowed these regimes to stabilize their rule. So that was, and that's in the 70s and 80s. Beginning in the 1990s, in Syria and earlier in some other countries, the regimes began to face very acutely the problem of how to pay for all this. Right, you're guaranteeing your education and healthcare and all these other things. You need to pay for it. There wasn't enough of a bourgeoisie, let's say, a capitalist class that made enough money that you can actually tax them and redistribute the wealth, right? Because of the way these regimes had emerged. So where are you going to get the funds from to do this? So for Syria, some of it was they had gas fields like in Deir ez-Zor and other places, and they sold that in the market. Some of it was due to aid from the Soviet Union. So this is why geopolitically it made sense for Syria to be in that block. Aid later in the 90s, it got aid for Iran as well. Right? But of course, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and all of a sudden they lost their major donor. And so the problem of what to do, how to pay for things, became an immediate challenge for them. And that's why they turned towards embracing the Western model of markets and privatizing basic services. There was a lot of land cooperatives, communal cooperatives that they broke up, state-held land that they privatized. So this is what I call neoliberalism, essentially. So there was a neoliberal turn in Syria beginning in the 1990s, but really accelerating after Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000. One of the consequences of the neoliberal turn is that a lot of the working class, who historically would be the class that would most be likely to put forth class demands, right? The working class was no longer kind of a unified actor, if it ever was, right? Rather, you had the growth of precarious labor, migrant workers. There's cities in Syria where, like, in every street, like one out of every three households, somebody's working as a construction worker in Lebanon or in Jordan or in the Gulf. So one of the things I argue in the article is that those are conditions that make it very difficult for people to recognize each other as part of a common class, right? So that's one reason why class consciousness, the awareness of yourself as part of a class, didn't grow in this process of neoliberalization. Just to get to your question of why class demands weren't made. There are other reasons too. There are many, many reasons for this. That's just one. The second is the role of the left in these countries. So in Syria, in many ways, because the land reform in Syria was, I think, the deepest of any of the Arab countries, it also meant that the Ba'ath regime was able to co-opt the left in a way to a much greater degree than it was even able to do even in Egypt or other countries. Not that they weren't co-opted there, but the Ba'ath regime was able to really co-opt the left. So the Communist Party split, so the majority went with the regime. There were other smaller left splinters that were in opposition, but they were tiny at that point, right? And so you had, by 2011, 30, 40 years of the left having mostly been co-opted by the regime, with some small exceptions. The left wasn't rooted. There was a left in Damascus and Aleppo on college campuses, for example, but the left wasn't rooted in small towns in Idlib or in the Aleppo countryside, places that were the hardest hit by the neoliberal reforms and places that were the center of the revolution. There was no real organized left in these places. That's the second reason. And I think the third reason, which is just as important, is that as the neoliberal turn took place beginning in the 1990s, the regime reversed its previous stance, which was a kind of almost aggressively secular stance that it had. And it began to allow, it did two things. One, it began to outsource some of its social services to Islamic charities. So you saw the growth, I think by 500-600%, the growth of charities, mostly Islamic charities, providing really sorely needed aid to poor communities, on the one hand. And two, they began to under the dictatorship, it was very difficult to do anything independently of the regime. To have even there was an emergency law that you couldn't have more than 4 people or 5 people in one place, right? They began to relax this, but only for religious functions. So in other words, they allowed a religious space to grow. And so, and religion is important for people in general, independent of that, but it also became an important way for people to make sense of their situation. It wasn't the only one. There's others. Football was very political, right, in Syria, and it became a kind of a proxy way of people to like work out political differences without doing it openly. There are a lot of different things that happened, but I think all of these kind of conspired together to the point where in 2011, what you had was an atomized working class that had no memory of conceiving of themselves as a class, number one. And number two, you had a culture in which the logical or the common sense way to articulate your grievances was in a language of Islam that precluded, not that it had to, but it did because of the historical trajectory, precluded a class consciousness. And I think that's what we had in 2011 when it started.
And you go in depth with like into not just Syria, but also Tunisia. And so what was the choice there to kind of pick in some ways, the worst case scenario, although I mean, Yemen is pretty bad as well, but like the worst case scenario and more or less the best case scenario, Tunisia being that exception?
Yeah, exactly. Because, I wanted to make this argument. I wanted to just, it's an obvious question. Well, what would it have looked like if some of these conditions hadn't been there? So Tunisia happens to be that case, where in Tunisia, you did have some of the many of the, aspects I mentioned, such as the atomization of the working class, et cetera, neoliberalization beginning in the late 1980s. But there was, for really kind of coincidental reasons, there was a very powerful trade union confederation, the UGTT, which managed to carve out a space independent of the regime, or at least, if not completely independent, at least not completely co-opted, if that makes sense, right? And so you had some force that wasn't completely co-opted by the regime, and it just shows the power that if you have that force, what it could do. And it was one of the most important political actors for 30, 40 years, this trade union confederation. So when the revolution happened in 2011, even though you still had this kind of precarious workforce, and you had marginal atomization and all that, you still had this trade union confederation where the trade union bureaucracy and the leadership were pretty subservient to the regime, but you had rank and file militants who had a degree of independence and had a history of organizing together and sometimes going against their leadership. And this proved to be, I think, pivotal and important in the events of 2011. And what I say there is that it basically what happens is you had a successful transition from a neoliberal autocracy to a neoliberal democracy.
Yeah, and in Syria, this wasn't possible. I mean, the reason that you just mentioned, but also because the trade unions were simply either crushed or completely co-opted.
Yeah, there were no independent trade unions in Syria at all. They're completely co-opted.
Okay, on a semi-related note, and this will be I think one or two questions that's a bit more on Afghanistan than on Syria. I think the only question actually. And the reason I'm asking is that now I'm going through your really good book, by the way, the No Good Men Among the Living. The question, so it may not necessarily be directly on Afghanistan. It's more like are there similar dynamics? And I have some difficulties in phrasing this because it's a bit vague in my mind, but like some similar dynamics between what happened or is happening in Afghanistan and what has been happening in Syria, maybe also in Iraq, not in terms of like similar actors or similar ideologies. There's some echoes there, but I know it's more complicated than that, but more in terms of just how misunderstood and how like persistently misunderstood these countries have been to the rest of the world, and to some extent even to locals. I think Syria is complicated even for Syrians, and I speak from experience here. So I don't know. Does that, first of all, does the question even make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, whether absolutely. I mean, in terms of misunderstandings, the legion, yeah, and but I think what, if anything, I think it's. In some ways, I couldn't pick two more different countries in Syria and Afghanistan, right? But if there's anything that ties the two together, it's in the Western mind and the Western perception that ISIS maybe is like what we think of now. If you go on the street asking about Syria, you think of ISIS and some poor person in an orange jumpsuit, right, being in an ISIS video maybe. And what do you think about in Afghanistan, the Taliban, right? So, I mean, these are countries that are unfortunately now, at least to the Western mind, defined by their extremes. So in that sense, there's a similarity. Obviously, there's another similarity in that the U.S. is both deeply implicated, and Russia, right, are deeply implicated in both of these countries. But there's, I think it's actually instructive maybe to look a little bit about what are the big differences between these two, because I think it is also, because that was just what, like, I think the person on the street who doesn't really follow this stuff thinks about. But then I think the other side is maybe on the left, there's also a tendency to just lump all these together as these are countries the United States is involved in. And there, I think we should be careful as well, because there's pretty remarkable differences. I mean, the most obvious one is that Syria, for whatever one thinks about what one should have done or what happened, it was ultimately the process. It was the consequence of a popular uprising. And that has to be a central part of anybody's analysis and calculations of what should be done or what is happening there, right? And in Afghanistan, tragically, that wasn't the case. I mean, of course, in 1979, 1980, they call it a popular revolution. The Parcham, for example, one of the Afghan Khalq, the Afghan Communist parties call it that, but it wasn't that at all. It was a top-down coup that was more or less forced upon a population that was not there with them politically, and there hasn't even been the sort of public that you have in Syria that results from the Syrian history of state formation, right? Colonialism and independent state formation that you would have in Afghanistan is very different. Similarities, there are other similarities though, which is that the kind of warlordism. So warlordism, by the way, here's probably a misunderstanding people have. Warlordism is new to Afghanistan. It dates to 1979, 1980. It's a gift of the CIA to Afghans. And now it's almost permanently a warlord society because of the way both the American intervention in the 80s and then more acutely post-2001, the way in which the US funded very strong men and created these warlords and commanders. That's also the story in Iraq. In Iraq, it was where the US allied with tribal sheikhs and basically created what are de facto warlords. Interestingly, that's very similar to what Russia is doing in the regime parts of Syria, And I think there's a deeper connection here, which is the neoliberalization of these militaries. Is a very interesting thing because, and I don't think really anybody's really looked into this, and somebody should. But for example, previously the U.S. military approach was that they would go like in Korea, let's say, or in Germany, right? It was a massive footprint, and the logistics were controlled by the U.S. military itself. Right. So everybody who's bringing the supplies, all of that were soldiers or who were Marines or whoever. Post 2000, 2001, the Rumsfeld model to try to have a light footprint, actually a lot of this was privatized. And so the fighting mostly is still done by soldiers, although of course in Iraq we know prominent examples like Blackwater, but that's not the case. But the fighting is mostly done by uniformed personnel. But a lot of the support work of logistics, security, all of that has been outsourced to the private sector. What that's done is that's what's created the warlordism, right? I'll give you an example. There's a highway near Fallujah. It's called Highway 10. And there's a US base that was there during the occupation. And both the insurgents and the US-backed sheikhs, all of them were making millions of dollars of either protecting or attacking and getting protection money on this highway. And so what the U.S. privatization did is it incentivized the fragmentation of these areas. It incentivized the warlordism of these areas. And Russia is doing the exact same thing. Russia has privatized many of its military functions. It has private security forces. It's also contracted, this time to regime cronies, all sorts of basic support services for their bases. And this has also created warlordism.
That's amazing. We literally have neoliberal warlordism at this point.
This is what we have. And I think this is a part of the story of why the U.S. has been unable to, quote unquote, pacify Afghanistan and Iraq. You have to think on one level, these are the most powerful military probably in the history of humanity, fighting a bunch of guys in sandals. And how can they not win? And I think part of the explanation is that they have privatized their own military to the point that they can't win. It's an extra, and now you're seeing this with Russia in the exact same way.
Yeah, and the following question is also actually a bit related to this because we're in 2021. So there's two parts of this question. I'll ask the first one first. So not only are we 10 years, more or less 10 years since the beginning of the Arab Spring, but we also happen to be 20 years since 9/11. Well, soon to be in the coming months. But it was very difficult for me not to, like, while reading the book, not to have these like what ifs in the back of my mind, and like what if they had just accepted that bin Laden be handed over, for example, in some condition. For some reason they said no, the Americans, I mean, or like the surrender of the Taliban, or like all of these things. And maybe we won't get too much into like the details of this, because I do want to focus on the Arab Spring and maybe on Syria. But I'm just curious as to like your thoughts, and this is again another big ask, but like on these past 20 years, looking at specifically on the post 9/11 landscape, it's very difficult to kind of take stock and realize that, you know, these are the consequences of very specific policies that have just taken over so much of the world right now, that in many ways, you know, like for my generation, it's just we took it for granted, really, like this is just the way things are and whatever, and had to affect in one way or another as well the Arab Spring, obviously, due to the generational dimension of the Arab Spring as well. But so like that's part of the question of the reflection. But then the other thing is, well, we're recording this on, by coincidence, like the last day of the Trump presidency. Tomorrow Biden takes office, and there's quite a lot of talk in America right now, and I do follow this a bit because I have like a morbid curiosity when it comes to the far right, on like the question of like, can it happen here? Like it could happen here, the name of the podcast by Robert Evans, which I recommend, by the way, it's a good one. But the question of like, can it happen here, in the sense of like internal tension, the rise of the militia movement, of white nationalism, the maybe aftermath of what happens when Trump actually leaves, and all of that stuff. And I'm very curious, as someone who you know, has spent some time in Afghanistan especially, but also like in Syria and Iraq. I do remember in one of your like while doing this research, in one of your talks, you mentioned how like you went to Afghanistan to better understand the US, to better understand America. And like 20 years later, what are some of the lessons, and I'm putting it very vaguely here, but like what are some of the lessons of Afghanistan that have helped you understand America in a way that you may have not understood in a different way? And if not Afghanistan, maybe Syria, Iraq, if that's more recent for you.
Well, there's a lot. I'll just try to maybe pick one or two. The most of what I've really understood about America, I've only been able to understand because I've had the benefit of some perspective looking at it from Syria or Afghanistan. But I just, one example, the storming of the Capitol. I mean, you know, there's a question of like what the response should be to this. And you know, the incoming Biden administration is talking about increasing the domestic terror, you know, toughening the domestic terrorism laws, right? So, or calling these people terrorists and applying specific legal designations for terrorism, right? And one thing I learned from not, you know, from Afghanistan and also from the war on terror at large is what a complete disaster that would be for our democracy here in the United States. Because what, I mean, a lot of people are focusing, and rightly so, on the danger that Trump poses and the far right poses to democracy. But there's a second danger at the same time that has been posed in kind of in a bipartisan consensus by this, maybe you call them the centrist or whatever you want to call them, which has been a steady chipping away at democratic freedoms. And I think 9/11 in the United States really was the beginning of that, where you have, I think even before, you know, in the 90s, you had the beginning of what was called the secret evidence laws, which is that immigrants here in the United States could be arrested and charged, and there could be evidence used against them which they can't actually see, which, you know, violates any basic norms of being able to see your accusers and what you've been accused of. After 9/11, thousands, tens of thousands of Muslims were rounded up, often on ridiculous pretexts. And actually, I don't know if you're up to that point in the book yet, but there's a chapter in my Afghanistan book where I describe all the absurd excuses and pretexts in which Afghans were sent to Guantanamo. And then almost the same thing was happening here in the United States, and the same framework and the same approach and policy. And so my concern is that instead of looking at the root causes of the far right and the phenomenon here, that instead we look at it at a surface level and respond to it in the way that we responded towards Arabs and Muslims. And that would be just terrible on a humanitarian level, but also terrible for the robustness of our democracy. So that's the danger. And I think most of the left and most of the people who aren't on the far right are attuned to the dangers of the far right, and that's good. But we need to be, I'm sorry to say, we need to be better attuned to the dangers of the liberals in this, because there's different ways in which our democracy can be eroded.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And it is something that it's very easy to not to forget. It's very easy to not focus on the long-term risks when people, rightly so, are especially worried about the short-term stuff. And this is somewhat related as well. Like one of the problems that we have today, uh, very broadly speaking, is the blurring between facts and fiction, the successes of disinformation and fake news and misinformation, all of that. Obviously, Trump being he was and still is a huge proponent of that. I'm actually curious to see what happens now that he doesn't have his Twitter toy. I do. And this is it's a question that I've asked previous guests, and some guests take it from different angle. Like someone who focuses on like anti-fascism work from a network building perspective would have a different answer than someone who focuses on the media landscape itself, and then the ethical concerns over Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And there's so much more. There's so much The problem is so much bigger than just should they say X or Y, or how to crack down on ISIS or whatever. And the ISIS example is actually a good example because they did take down a lot of ISIS content, but they also, because it was more or less a machine learning program, they took down quite a lot of documentation of war crimes in Syria. And yeah, and at some point, like, they even took down just random Muslims doing random stuff because the algorithm just couldn't know the difference. And one of my it's become a big concern of mine. It's misinformation, disinformation, especially, and what to do about it. And I'm personally as concerned about. I do have a link to this. I'm kind of taking a tangent a bit, but I am even much more concerned in some ways by the fact that there is such a thing as a network effect, and there's so much being dependent on Twitter, for example, rather than much more so than what Twitter does or doesn't do, if you see what I mean. The fact that there is so much of journalism that does have to depend on Twitter in the first place, as an example. But it's also like just the algorithms themselves, especially on Google. Like YouTube has gotten a reputation for that, and Facebook has gotten a reputation for that. And there is a link there between the fact that, for example, the Arab Spring, a lot of it happened via or through or thanks to whatever social media, or at least it was part of the catalyst. It was part of how people were being organized. And, as a Lebanese, I know that in Lebanon, it happens quite a lot as well. And we, it's 10 years ago now that we remember the op-eds of like the Twitter revolution and the Facebook revolution and whatever. And people on the streets on Arab streets would actually be thanking Facebook, and you had these funny signs and whatever. And now Sorry? Yeah. And now 10 years down the line, I don't know, it does feel like the narrative has changed quite a bit on that, but I don't see anything being done about it. And it's kind of one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about the fact that we depend, I also I'm not judging anyone because I do it myself, the Twitter threads and whatever, whenever there would be protests in Lebanon. I'm not saying it's bad per se. I'm just concerned about how much of our agency we are giving away. And this is a bit vague in my mind, so I apologize if it's a bit confusing, but I am concerned as to how much we're able to then plan something that requires long-term thinking, like, a revolution, when so much is being done in the short term. And I think this is actually being influenced, and like negatively so, by these infrastructure that I just described rather poorly. And my question to you is, like, from a journalistic perspective, as a journalist, how do you approach these tools, and how do you see these tools having changed in the past 10 years since the heydays, or at least how it used to be described, how it was perceived as like the Facebooks and the Twitter at the time being like a catalyst for the Arab Spring?
I guess I'll start by saying, I have to say that I'm not fully convinced that, Facebook and Twitter were a catalyst for the Arab Spring, any more so than the telephone or the telegraph was a catalyst for the Russian Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Me neither, by the way. Just I'm putting it out there.
Sure. Because I think that these were useful tools, but there's parts of Syria that I really focus on, which is Idlib and the Aleppo countryside. To this day, nobody uses Twitter there. And definitely in 2011, nobody used Twitter, nor did they even have Facebook at that time. They were like organizing protests through Skype and that kind of thing. So really the way they got to know each other is because they played football or whatever. They had prior ties of trust to each other before the uprising. Probably that'd be different now because those places now everybody uses Facebook. So I agree there. I think it's a complicated thing. So on the one hand, I would just on the one hand say the benefits of it, okay, and then the dangers of it, because I think we have seen a real democratization of the public sphere because of social media. Just as a journalist, I know that there's things that one can say publicly that they couldn't have said 20 years ago. Speaking of myself as somebody from the left, right? There's just basic things you can say that you can't.
Absolutely, yeah.
Losing your job 20 years ago, right? So that's a positive thing. And because there's just so many groups that can now like voice their own opinion, that's a positive thing. I think part of the problem is that it's anarchic in the worst sense of that word, in that there's no structure. Anybody can say anything they want, and then it's left to the power of Jack or whoever to decide when to say Trump, 10 days before he leaves office, this is too much for Trump. Right?
Yeah.
And to me, the question is like, why should we be investing that kind of for such a vital resource, which is the public sphere, so a good portion of it, which is now mediated through these networks, these platforms. Why should that be in the hands of a private individual? How is that any different from, I don't know, like some kind of dictatorship, I think, right? Where there's other models, whether the Wikipedia model, even if it has weaknesses, is one model, but there's other kinds of models we can think about, but all of those models would require removing it from the private sphere. Like this is way too important. If whatever one thinks about privatization in general, the free market, this I would say is way too important to be left to the whims of a board somewhere. And so they should be socialized. And will that solve all the problems? No, of course not. I don't think it's going to solve all the problems, but I think in terms of thinking about what would be a step in the right direction, and then putting structure on these things, like if we could democratically decide how to structure these things, what kind of speech is out of bounds, what kind of speech isn't, to me, that's much better than either saying anything goes and all sorts of insanity ensues, or leaving it up to the whims of some CEO somewhere, right? I think that's the best way in my mind to try to make sense of this or to use this kind of resource. But this is it's a challenge. I think with here in terms of social media, there's some days where I just wish I wasn't on Twitter at all, and I just I'm like, why am I even scrolling? Doom scrolling is the term, now.
It's the word of 2020, I believe now.
Yeah, it's really yeah. So there's definitely but like most of the democracy is a messy thing. To be honest, so I'm writing a book now about Manbij, city of Manbij, which is a city of about 100,000, about an hour and a half from Aleppo, right? And there was a period of about 18 months in which Manbij was independent city-state, participatory democratic city-state, right? And it was really messy. There was conspiracy theories, there was wild mobs, there was beautiful things, there was a flowering of self-activity, all that stuff together in one space. And I think it would be very easy to kind of step aside it and just condemn the whole thing because of the weaknesses. But that's the nature of democracy, I think, is that we have to look at the principle of it, which is that it has to be in our own hands. And then we can collectively try to figure out how to make sense of it, how to make it better. Here today with social media, we're not even there. We're not even anywhere near there, right? The question is should we censor? Should we should they disallow this or not?
Yeah, and I think I don't have much to add to that. And part of my problem isn't even what happens to Trump's Twitter account or whatever. I couldn't care less. It's just it's the reactive nature of it, that we're just reacting to outside event, and then we pressure or we try to campaign like a small hand, like as you said, like a board or a Jack Dorsey in this case or whatever, and beg him to do this one thing or whatever. But then it's just so much, the problem is just so much bigger than that. And my concern is more over basically energy consumption, how much energy we're spending into one certain thing rather than other more long-term issues.
To go back to, I think one of the questions you raised a bit earlier, it's like, how do we do long-term strategizing, long-term planning under these circumstances, right? I think that, if you think about Twitter as the agora or the public space or a mob, whichever one you want to think about it as, right? We've had those throughout history, and they've never been conducive to long-term planning, right? What we really had, to me, there's no shortcut and there's no way around being, and I mentioned this in the article, being rooted in communities and having ties to those communities and then building And it's kind of thankless work, right?
Yeah.
It's like doing all these things and boring meetings and going to protests of 15 people or whatever. And then, but if you're able to do that in such a way as to build a base, I think that could be the bulwark against this. In other words, like my point being that like long-term planning can only ever happen in the real world, and it can happen face to face and over kind of the lived experience of going through struggle. And in that sense, I'm not any more pessimistic about the possibility of long-term planning post social in the social media age than it was before.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. And I don't myself have an answer on this, to be honest. I ask it to different guests, and more like I continue to think about it myself.
Yeah.
I have like one final question before we sort of wrap it up, if that's okay. One thing that I'm struck by, I did mention the cynicism of it all at some point, and I'm not gonna repeat that. But one thing that if you open just random videos of even yourself, like on YouTube, there was a Democracy Now! Interview that you did in 2017 or something, and it's a long one. I'll link it. It's a good one, but the comments are what you might predict, and so I'm not asking you to respond to the comments. It doesn't matter. But one thing that it just made me think of is whenever we hear denialism of like Syrian war crimes and Russian war crimes in Syria, whenever like American war crimes are actually mentioned and are actually investigated, like what Bellingcat does or what you've done or other people have done or Syrians have done, obviously, as well, that doesn't get the attention that you would think, or one would think, those that are so opposed to American intervention in the region or whatever, like the attention that they would give that, if that makes sense. And I think the interpretation I have, because I've been kind of trying to wrap my head around it, other than well, they're just racist and Islamophobic and they don't really care, whatever. Like that's part of it for sure. It also feels that if they do pay attention to American war crimes in Syria, at some point they will have to pay attention to Syrian and Russian war crimes in Syria, because the scale is just on a different level, especially the Assad regime, obviously. And that's where a lot of the left, or the authoritarian left, or whatever terms we want to use, I feel like that's where they don't want to go. That's where they don't go. And here I think I'm even giving them too much credit, assuming that they think that far on that. But like, what are your thoughts on this? As I know that you have been at the receiving end of a lot of it, and I tend not to mention names because, again, I feel that they love the attention, but just as a phenomenon more than anything, to kind of try and understand the root causes or what to do about it, or like basically just like your 2 cents on this.
Well, it's interesting. As you said, I've been attacked a lot by people. Sometimes there's one individual who I wrote an article about U.S. Killing thousands of civilians, me and Azmat Khan in Iraq, and this person had me on and was very praiseworthy about the article. And then I wrote an article later about Syria, and the same person was attacking me as a U.S. apologist. He had me on his podcast, I should say. So I think to some extent they're not even doing it in good faith. Rather, there's a sense that goes back to what you were saying earlier about how there's kind of a way in which you can tamp up the outrage online and accrue followers, and there's get retweets and this kind of thing, which probably releases some endorphins in their brain or something. I don't know. But I think that one thing I've noticed about these individuals, and some of these people I know actually pre-Syria. I've known these people from back when, in terms of like Palestine Solidarity Organizing or whatever. I've known these people, right? Is that they've never really been connected to grassroots organizing, and rather had been building a brand of a sort. And I think, and this maybe is a way to tie up this in your previous question, which is that I've been fortunate. I'm lucky that I came into this in a very different way. Who knows? Maybe I came into in the way they did, I would be the same way, right? But I came into it in the sense that when I was like much younger, I was, I was in an organization. I was doing politics, and I was a union organizer, right? And I was doing this for 10, 15 years. And so I have that experience that's been able to pull me in a different direction. And I noticed none of them have. They haven't ever been connected to real organizing. And maybe that's also the answer to some of our quandaries and qualms about social media is that, there's no easy fix for these things, but there are ways we can, work on the ground, and it's kind of thankless work that we can do that can act as a counterweight in some way, kind of ground us maybe.
Yeah, I agree with that, and thanks for that. I think that's a good way of linking the two. That it's not necessarily a social media question in the abstract and the absolute, but more like how is it used, and it's also, honestly, I think it's also a quantity question. Like how much is it used? Like someone spending 18 hours a day, it's not the same as someone spending 10 minutes a day. Like I think that's a boring point that doesn't really matter here.
Also, not to interrupt you, just to say, also that one of the things you have to do when you're doing like politics in the small p, like on the ground with people, is you have to talk to them and convince them, right? And you have to meet them where they are, whatever it is, right? If you're neighborhood organizing or whatever, you don't really have to do that in social media. You just kind of have to build a platform, build a brand and let the masses come to you. It lacks that reciprocity that's implicit and vital to democratic political organizing, and I think that's partly at the end of the day why they go in that direction.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. Okay, well, to wrap up this conversation, I'll ask you what I've been asking guests recently. If you have 3 books to recommend to listeners, what would they be? And it's 3 books minimum. You can recommend as many as you want.
3 books. I guess I'll tell you the 3 most recent books that I read. One was Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. It's a novel, if you know it. Came out in like 2006, and it's like an epistolary novel. It's about a preacher who's writing letters to. Dying preacher writing letters to his son, and I read it when it came out, and I have to say that when I read it when it came out, I hated it because I was just fiercely arrogant in my secularism at the time, and I was like, what is this kind of religious stuff? I'm not going to read it. I mentioned this because you asked earlier about ways in which my work in the Middle East has changed how I've seen the United States. Is that one of the things is since 2011, I've been working there, so it's now 9 years. It's really, I think, made me appreciate the varieties of belief people have, and not trying to be so imperious about curious about what I think I know. And one of the things the book does really well is it talks about having like an epistemic humility. Not really. You can say what you don't believe, but you should be much more cautious in saying what really is you believe. And so that's why this book resonated with me a lot. It was a beautiful book. She's a great, amazing writer. So I love that. What else? I read Thucydides, finally, something I've always wanted to do. And I've been reading a lot of the Greeks these days. I read all of Thucydides, which is a long book. But, one of the things that was really great in that book is that every time, he always talks about the ways in which really local, granular struggles in some city-state in Greece or wherever can lead over into international or intra-city-state wars. So almost every time there was the number of times he talked about an uprising of the poor against the rich, or one faction wanting democracy, the other faction wanting oligarchy, and somebody called in the Spartans and somebody else called in the Athenians. It was a really it's a great way of I know that book is used a lot, I guess, in international relations, and I feel like oftentimes in international relations the internal politics of the country tends to get left aside, even though Thucydides is supposed to be their master.
Sure, yeah.
Let's see, third book that I read. I'm reading Crime and Punishment now, a third of the way through. So don't tell me how it ends.
I haven't read it yet.
I have the new translation. Apparently there was one woman who translated pretty much every single thing written, every single novel, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, written in Russian in the 20s. And her language is very Victorian and very kind of stodgy. And this is a new translation by this team. It's very modern. And so I think I've read Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, is one of my favorite books. So I've always wanted to read this. Yeah,
that one I have read, and I do recommend it as well. Awesome. Well, Anand, thank you a lot for your time. This has been amazing.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.